Before we get started and whatnot, the basic format is that we have an informal webinar, plenty of time for people to ask questions. We always record it because our community is spread across the world. So here in Japan, it's actually midnight now. In the US, it's very early in the West Coast. So not everyone can attend each event. So mostly the audience today will be probably sourced from Europe. And we will have the recording available within about 48 hours for everyone else to drop in and have a look. So before we get started, as usual, in the OpenChain meetings, we show the Linux Foundation antitrust policy notice. The purpose of this is to make sure everyone is fully aware of our work around the antitrust area, that they can read our policy and they can contact our antitrust counsel if they so wish. If no one has any questions about that, then we will move to the main event. So today's an interesting one. I actually got started in the ecosystem of FreeDOS, amazingly. Jim founded the project, I believe, about 20-something years ago now. Mm-hmm. It's been the host to many a person as they come up through the ranks in learning open source. And I thought what was interesting would be, from our perspective, as the industry standard for open source compliance, Section 5 of our 6-part standard is about community contribution. And it's agnostic about whether people contribute or not. But when it comes to community contribution, the question is always, how do we approach this? How do we do things like recognize a project that is worth contributing to? Or how do we form a project that is going to function? And how do we engage with the project effectively? And we can do this in certain dry ways, such as, let's say, talking specifically about Kubernetes or something like this. But I thought it would be more fun to look at how communities are managed sustainably through the optics of FreeDOS. Most of us will have encountered FreeDOS, but it's not something that's going to be a core to one of our fields. Our cloud providers, our enterprise software people, everyone else has their own favorite toys. So FreeDOS is this wonderfully neutral and useful example of a multi-decade community with consistent contributors and releases and management across, I think, whole epochs of intellectual property management around open source licensing. And we're very fortunate to have Jim Hall, the founder of FreeDOS, here to talk about how a multi-decade project was built with consensus, and how it's managed and why it works. So Jim, you're also involved with many other things. I believe you're also a contributor to the Gnome project, and you've been involved in all types of areas of software management and so on in both the academic sphere and elsewhere. So what I'd like to do, if it's okay with you, is basically hand over the discussion about how FreeDOS is a sustainable community. And you can structure it how you want. If you want to do it strong presentation style, if you want us to pause occasionally for questions, whatever works best for you.
Let me just kind of give some background and I'll kind of walk us through the history and the community of FreeDOS, and then as people have comments or questions, I'd be happy to answer those kind of as we go. And so, yeah, as you said, all right. So as you said, I've been involved in open source software since 1993, so quite a long time. Just briefly, my first experience in open source software was as a undergraduate student. I was a physics student, and I spent a lot of time in our computer lab. And our Unix systems had a number of free software packages from the Free Software Foundation, like GNU Emacs, as well as some other things like GNU Plot and things like that. And so I thought that was kind of a neat idea, that people were creating this software that I found extremely powerful, very easy to use, and they're just giving it away under a license where you could actually look at the source code yourself. And I was so intrigued that, when I was looking to upgrade my computer, I looked around for a Unix system. Now, I'd been I sort of was grew up with computers as they kind of became available in the home, and so my first computer was an Apple II. Then we moved on to a PC, and so I became a real DOS person back in the 80s into the 1990s. But exploring the Unix systems, I thought was a very powerful. I consider it kind of basically on a simple level, sort of a more powerful version of DOS. It just kind of lacked some of the applications that DOS had. So this concept of, time to upgrade my computer, 1993, I started to look pretty closely at what Unix systems I could run on my computer instead of, let's say instead of DOS. Well, I'd already, as I said, been sort of exposed to open source software, and when I asked around on Usenet, which was an early way to communicate with other people on the internet, people said, you might consider this new thing called Linux. Okay, well, I gave Linux a try, and my first Linux was SLS Linux, which is Soft Landing Linux Systems, if I recall correctly. And I think it was like 1.03, and it had Linux kernel version 0.99, like I think patch level 11. It was really early on, and that was actually in the 0.99 days. It was a monolithic kernel, and so it didn't actually have the modules that you got with the 1.0 release. And so it was very similar to a DOS system. And I thought that was great. I still had a dual boot system, so I could, run my DOS applications that I needed to run, because I was a real fan of the DOS applications that I had. But here I had a fully functioning Unix system. And what was great is I could access the source code. I could see how things worked. And since I was, basically a self-taught programmer, I really liked reading the source code so I could sort of figure out how things worked. And so that was a really neat thing. Well, let me skip forward a little bit. And the next year, Microsoft had started doing these interviews in the technology press about how the next version of Windows is going to completely do away with DOS, right? DOS is dead. And I still used DOS. I mean, I was running Linux, but the applications just weren't there for Linux yet. And so I was always booting back to DOS to run a spreadsheet that I used to do word processing, because Linux didn't really have a word processor. LaTeX, NROF, that's not really word processing. And so I would jump back to DOS to do, mostly those types of applications. And so I really liked DOS. I still liked DOS, even though I was running Linux. And this idea that Microsoft was going to kill DOS, the DOS was going to go away. And they said, yeah, the next version of Windows is going to completely kill DOS. I'm like, gosh, I know what Windows looks like. My parents ran it. We had it in our computer lab as well. And I just thought, gosh, if Windows 3.2 or 4.0, whatever it was going to be called, if that next version looked anything like 3.1, I didn't want it, right? Because Windows 3.1, for anybody who remembers it, was not very stable. It was slow. It was clunky. Sometimes an app would freeze up and it would take down the system. And so I just I don't want that. And so I said, I'd rather have an open source version. I'd rather have my own version of DOS. And because Linux was working great in my machine, this whole concept of people who get together and create an open source Linux had worked really well. I thought, well, we could do that with DOS. DOS is not that complicated, so we should be able to create an open source version of DOS. So I asked around again on Usenet, and people said, that's a great idea. You should do that. And so I said, okay, well, I will. And so July 29, 1994, I announced that we would have a project to create an open source version of DOS. And that's where we are, some 20 something years later. So the great thing about FreeDOS is that, it does show how open source projects really work. I mean, so if you're going to create an open source software project, it's not, I open up the code and then people will automatically show up. You have to show that you've got something that is worth trying and something that's worth contributing to. So this whole point about show me the code absolutely is a real thing. And so what I did is I started by saying, okay, I can sort of use a divide and conquer kind of approach. And so I kind of divided up this concept that became FreeDOS into 3 different parts. I said, okay, we need a kernel, and we need drivers, and we need to have obviously the user space utilities, things like an fdisk, command com, things like that. And so I said, okay, I've got a number of utilities that I'd written on my own to make the MS-DOS command line more powerful, especially after I discovered Linux, and I was trying to recreate some of those Linux utilities on DOS. And so I had a set of utilities that kind of replicated the MS-DOS command line. Actually, in some cases, did more than the MS-DOS command line. I wasn't a computer science student; I was a physics student, and so my coding skills weren't, advanced. If you look at the code, it's not terribly mature code that I wrote back in 1984, but it was code that worked. It's code that did the job. And I released that under the GNU GPL. And I said, here's what I've started. I started writing some programs, and I also scoured a bunch of different what are called FTP sites. So it's basically, before we had websites, we had these FTP sites, these file transfer protocol archive sites, and I found a number of public domain utilities, specifically things. I was looking for things where people had released the source code, because this is before the concept of the Free Software Foundation, before the concept of open source software, but people still released software in that way. They still released programs for DOS in the 80s into the 90s where they gave away the source code. They just put it under a license that was usually public domain. This is something that anybody can use for whatever reason. Some people put some other kind of a license on it, but I collected these different utilities I thought mimicked or replaced parts of MS-DOS. And then that sort of became the basis of FreeDOS, the early FreeDOS. And so if you go back and look at the very, very early versions of FreeDOS, there's a lot of these mixed utilities that don't quite do the same thing that MS-DOS did, but it does the same kinds of tasks, if you kind of get my drift. It's not the exact same command, but it does something very, very similar. So for example, one of them was a replacement for the MS-DOS print command. So MS-DOS print was a thing that would let you do some background printing. And I found a similar command called spool that would do, something a little bit more, I would say, Unix LPD-like printing. And what was really neat on a dot matrix printer, where you actually watch the printing head go back and forth, spool would use more computing cycles if the less you used your computer. So if you kind of stop typing for a while and you happen to be printing, you can actually hear the print head speed up. And as you started to type and do something, do more work, it started to slow down because it was trying to use some cycles when you weren't actually doing something. And so in terms of community, so I released that source code. I released an initial version. This is kind of what I'm doing. This is where I'm starting. And the fact that you released something that actually people can use has some base level of functionality, then you get some people that are like, that's cool. You're doing something kind of neat. And so I'm going to contribute to that as well. And so we had almost right away, we had several people that joined this project that became FreeDOS. And we had one person, Tim Norman, who started work on a replacement for Command Com, which is a pretty big ask. We had some other people that contributed some other programs. And that's where the community really started. And so, how do you keep that? How do you build that community? Once you've got a community started, well, we started to make sure that we stayed in communication, right? It all starts with communication. And so we at that point, we were using a lot of Usenet. And so we were discussing things on Usenet. We were exchanging emails a lot. So that way we were always staying in touch with everybody else. You can't build a community unless you're talking to people in the community. I kind of was figuring this out as I went because, you know, I was an undergraduate student. And so I didn't really have any background before this around, you know, community management like you'd have today. And so I was just doing things that I thought made the most sense at the time. So let's make sure we're talking to people. Let's have a communication channel for that. And more importantly, we made it welcoming for other people to join. We wanted to set the bar very, very low if you wanted to join. So we set a rule that said any of these core utilities, things that replaced MS-DOS, we wanted those to be written in either assembly or C. Now, assembly is kind of a broad thing. There's lots of different assemblers, but generally we want it to be assembly or we want it to be C for the main stuff, because that was what most of us knew. But other people were wanted to contribute some other things. I said, well, I wrote some utilities that made my DOS experience a little bit better too. And so I'd like to contribute that to FreeDOS in some way. And so we tried to find ways to accept those utilities. Oh yeah, that is a great utility. We should try to find a way to put that in. And so FreeDOS very quickly grew from having basically a replacement of DOS, where it was just, we're going to replace all the different utilities, all the different commands that DOS has, and we're going to replace them with, you know, one for one stuff. It grew from that idea into now suddenly having that plus a bunch of other stuff. And so we had quickly grew utilities, a set of extra utilities that did a whole bunch of things that MS-DOS never did. We had found open source compilers and assemblers. And so now we had an ability to start programming for FreeDOS using tools that were open, as opposed to, well, I have a copy of the Borland compiler, I have a copy of the Turbo compiler, I have a copy of the Quick C compiler, and that's how we contribute. Now it's like, okay, we actually had some compilers that were open source. And so it's other things like that, you know, other, we started creating these categories inside FreeDOS that did lots of other things. If you go back and look at our alpha and our beta releases, that's where you started to see this expansion into these other kinds of things. But always, we made sure that we released the source code. And so most programs were distributed at that time under the GNU General Public License. At that time, it was version 2. But we had some other licenses in there as well. But we always wanted to make sure that the source code was something that people could see. So you know, that's where we went. So if you're contributing something, it's like, okay, great, contribute that, but also make sure you're, you know, sharing the source code. We eventually had a file archive. I think very quickly had a file archive hosted by, at the time it was called Sunsite at the University of North Carolina, and now it's called iBiblio at the same location. And so that's where our archive lives today. It's at biblio.org. And so if you want to download FreeDOS, you know, obviously we have a website that'll point you how to get the full distribution, but you can also go to our archive at iBiblio and just download sort of onesie, twosie sort of stuff as well. And that was always there. So making the code available, making these programs easy to get, making sure that we're communicating with people, and then eventually setting up a system where people could report bugs, right? Because we can't get better unless we know some areas where we're kind of falling down. And so we found, we started using, I think we've used about 3 different bug tracking tools across our history now, but different ways to report bugs. So that way, if you were a new developer, and again, we're trying to find ways to encourage people to join. So if you were a new developer and you wanted to contribute to FreeDOS, but you didn't have like a utility that you already had, then, and you just wanted to contribute in some way, well, here's a list of things to do. Here's a list of things that we need. And so we might point you to some bugs that need fixing, some need addressing, some features that people are looking for, or some other work that needs to get done, right? If you go to any open source software project, they will tell you that they need better documentation. That's a universal. And so if you wanted to contribute to FreeDOS, we would often ask, hey, if you don't know what to work on, maybe you could help us with our documentation, or help us so that way programs could be more easily compiled, for example, on a different compiler. So, that's kind of where our community started. And I think that's kind of where our community has remained. Those core tenets of making sure that it's easy to join, it's easy to contribute, and we want to be welcoming. We want to open those doors. We don't want to make it where you have to be, this tall to ride this ride. It has to be, if you want to contribute, then contribute in the way that suits you best. On our website today, we have a web page that if you want to contribute, it actually has different categories. Like if you are somebody who has virtually no experience in computer programming, here's a number of things that you could do. If you've got some moderate level of experience in computer programming, here's some other things you might tackle. This kind of feels like things you might be able to do. If you're a very experienced developer, we got a third category. These are some things that you might do. Some rewriting of a utility, maybe a new version of Command Comp, which has been on my list for a while. And so we just try to have these ideas, and it works. People do come to you, and they're like, all right, so I've been interested in FreeDOS for a while. I've been following it for a while, and now I finally, I saw something on your website. You're looking to have this, and so I wrote it. And so it pops up, or people will contribute things that are on the list. So things can't happen unless you try to find ways to open doors. And I think a core tenet is that we're trying to be welcoming. And I'll also say an extra thing on that is that we have a number of different ways to talk to one another in FreeDOS. We've always had our mailing lists. There's some other forums out there that people have set up, message boards basically, where you can talk about FreeDOS. We have a Facebook group, we have a Twitter, lots of different ways to communicate. And so the idea that I have there is that I want to go to where people are. I shouldn't have to, sit in a tower and expect that you're going to come to me. I need to find ways to get to where people are. And so, having a Twitter account, so that way people can just follow you on Twitter and see what's going on. So every time we have a news item pops up, I try to get posted on Twitter within a day. Twitter, we do some other kinds of engagement. Facebook is a great way for people to ask questions about FreeDOS and not feel like they have to join a mailing list. For some people, joining a mailing list, kind of a big deal. So, you can talk about FreeDOS and just sort of lurk without having to worry about email, filling up your inbox. Lots of different ways to contribute. In fact, now, for the last couple of months, I would say since sometime, I think we started doing this late last year, we now do these virtual get-togethers. And so, in fact, we got another one coming up on Sunday. And so I post this on Twitter, on Facebook, on our website, that if you want to get together and actually talk to people, like real time, face to face, you can feel free to join our virtual get-togethers. Because again, it's another way to kind of reach out to people where they are. We're all kind of used now to using video chat, to communicating over video meetings, and so that's another way that we're doing things. I have a consulting company, and so I have a video meeting service that I subscribe to, and so I've made that available to the FreeDOS these virtual get-togethers once a month. We'll just hook up for an hour or hour and a half, where I think we've gone as long as 2 hours, just getting together and talking about things. They're not aimless. We actually do have some goals that we want to talk about during those meetings. But what's great for me is I've been able to meet some people in FreeDOS in these virtual get-togethers that I've never met or seen or heard live ever. And they may have been part of the FreeDOS project since 1994 when we created the FreeDOS project. They may have joined in 2000. And we've only exchanged emails with one another. I've never actually seen them, talk to them ever. And now we finally get to actually see each other, talk to each other. And it's a great way to stay connected. So, if you're looking for examples on community management, it's like, find channels to reach out to people, find ways to engage.
I have a question related to the governance of the project. You mentioned you chose the GPL license, and it was around the time of early Linux.
Mhm.
Was the motivation on licensing purely to follow Linux, or was there a different motivation on it? And I have a follow-up, which is, in the subsequent period, there were various other licenses either rising to prominence or providing alternatives. For instance, at one point, the BSD licenses got really popular.
Mhm.
Then there was the GPL3, which some people were very enthusiastic about. So did you ever consider changing the licensing model, and how did you manage that with the growing community as opposed to your individual decision originally?
Yeah, so licensing is I think a pretty important piece there as well. So let me kind of talk about licenses. When we first started FreeDOS, it was actually called PDDOS. That stood for Public Domain DOS, because as an undergraduate, I just didn't understand the finer points between public domain and free software. Free as in the Free Software Foundation. So I called it public domain because I thought we were giving this into the public domain. But at the same time, MS-DOS was still a thing. You also had PC-DOS, DR-DOS, right? PC-DOS from IBM, DR-DOS from Digital Research. And that's also kind of what drove the name PD-DOS, because if you got MS-DOS, PC-DOS, DR-DOS, well, it's kind of like two letters and then DOS. So PD-DOS kind of fit into that scheme. But with all these other DOSes out there, and there were others as well, we didn't want people to take the code that we'd written and wanted other people to see that source code. We didn't want people to actually like take that and suddenly turn it into a proprietary thing. We didn't want that source code to be turned into a closed source thing. And so we were very aware at the beginning that we didn't want Microsoft or Digital or IBM or somebody else to take our open source stuff and turn it into a proprietary thing. So we wanted to pick a license that reflected that. As I said, I was already familiar with Linux, I was exploring the source code for Linux. And so the GNU GPL was something that came up all the time. Of course, so I was familiar with how the GNU GPL version 2 worked, because I saw that all the time, and that was a popular license at the time. And so I use the GNU GPL for all of my stuff. Now, people in the FreeDOS project, I said I just wanted to make sure that people are sharing source code in a way that follows that same concept, excuse me, where people can always view the source code, but we don't want this to be really turned into something that can be sort of turned back into closed source. And so by default, a lot of people were using the GNU GPL. But at the time, I don't think at the beginning, I don't think I had any kind of mandate. In fact, even today, I don't think I really have a mandate that says, thou shalt use the GNU GPL. Although we have always said that stuff in the core, stuff in what we call the base, which replicates the behavior of MS-DOS, that has to be under the GNU GPL or a similar open source software license, because there are lots of them out there. Especially now, the Open Source Initiative has established a very good list of what they consider open source licenses, and the Free Software Foundation has a similar list of things that they consider good free software licenses. But back then it was sort of we wanted to reflect those values of, we want to give that source code away, and people should be able to use that source code, but not turn it back into a closed source thing, right? It should always remain open.
So that's
a lot of people.
Oh, sorry.
Well, I was gonna say, so a lot of people kind of defaulted to the GNU GPL, and that was, I think, an important part of growth. Now, I will also say, by the way, we occasionally, and by we, I'll say mostly me, kind of fell into well, here's a really cool program that somebody has released. They've released it, the documentation, the license says this is available for free. You can use it at no cost. Anybody can use it. I'm just not giving away the source code. And, that was tempting. And it was too tempting in some cases, where actually some of those programs made it into the FreeDOS distribution. Several of those decisions came back later to bite us, where we said, okay, well, we'll include these free, as in gratis, programs, but they're not open source, because the danger there is you don't really see where you don't see where it came from. And one case that I remember is an assembler that somebody had released and said, this is available for free, anybody can use it, but I'm just not giving away the source code. And it was a very good assembler. It was very, very compatible with Microsoft Assembler. And we learned later, as people were starting to kind of poke at it, try to understand how this assembler worked, that, you know, it seems like this assembler is probably a modified version, binary modified version of the Microsoft assembler. Looks like somebody went through and very carefully replaced all the terms that say Microsoft with another name that was the same number of letters. And you know, we took that out. As soon as we discovered that was the case, we took it out. And so over time, since then, I wanted to make very, very sure that everything that's in FreeDOS is under an open source software license. You have to be able to see the source code. And even with the new release that we're working on, FreeDOS 1.3, looking very carefully at some programs that, you know, if they're not under an open source software license or they're not open source software enough, let's remove them, right? I want to make sure that this is something that everybody can use. And so I'm trying to go, you know, closer to that open source ideal. There's another part of your question. What was the other part of your question? I want to make sure I answer that.
When through the years licenses changed and flavors changed, like GPL3, did you have certain pressure to change license? How was that managed? And the optic I'd like to put on it is that I know that, for example, some companies distributed laptops with FreeDOS. I think Hewlett Packard did. So I guess that might also play into discussions on licensing.
Yeah, so you know, we always kind of welcomed whatever licenses people wanted to use. If you wanted to contribute to FreeDOS and you had a favorite license, then fine, as long as it was an open source software license and other people were allowed to use the program and allowed to examine the source code and use it for whatever they wanted to do, then that was a license that you could use. And so, you know, you do find, you know, the most common licenses pop up as well in FreeDOS, right? You see a lot of GNU GPL source code. You see some stuff that's under BSD, MIT, Apache, things like that. And so you're seeing a variety of licenses. You do see some programs that are the GNU GPL version 3, but it's not something that we made an intentional shift to. Because FreeDOS is not really, it's more like a Linux distribution. It's more like a Fedora or an Ubuntu or something like that, where it's really a full distribution made up of individual packages. And so it's those individual packages that kind of pick their own license. And so somebody who wrote a, let's say FDisk, which partitions your hard drive, or somebody who made a format program which puts a file system down on that partition, or somebody who made a really clever version of copy or something like that, debug, those are all individual packages and people can use their own licenses for that. So no, there was never really an intentional move towards the GNU GPL version 3, which is something that people kind of did on their own. And again, as long as the software was open source and other people could use it and use that software and that source code how they wanted to, that was kind of the bar.
When it came to contributions, did you ever have companies drop in to help with building out stuff? Because after all, some companies were using it.
Yeah, so you do actually have some companies that over time had distributed FreeDOS, as you mentioned. So you had Dell, who put FreeDOS on some of their machines. I think it was the N series. You mentioned earlier, you know, HP distributed some machines that have FreeDOS on them, and there's some other ones as well. And you know, no, none of those companies ever came back and contributed to FreeDOS really in any way. You know, they were kind of using FreeDOS as a system to put on their system. Now, or an operating system to put on their hardware. You know, what I always recommend though is if you're a company and you're using open source as part of your business model, you really should invest in that open source software in some way. Maybe that's contributing money to help that project along. Maybe it's having developers contribute to that program. Maybe it's providing hosting, right? There's lots of different ways that you can support an open source software program. None of those companies that actually distributed FreeDOS really did support FreeDOS like directly, like having developers join. Although I do have a Patreon, and until recently, there was a German company that was a major sponsor in my Patreon. And that was, I actually got an email from the CEO, the owner, when he started contributing to my Patreon, saying that he was a longtime fan of FreeDOS, and he wanted to make sure that FreeDOS was continuing forward. And so, you do have some companies that do contribute in that way, but as far as the Dells and the HPs that were including FreeDOS on their hardware, I don't recall that any of them actually contributed to FreeDOS, through code or anything else like that.
I do have a follow-up on that related to contribution policies and so on. Do you have any specific contribution policies, or is it truly free-form in how people can engage and develop code?
We do have a FreeDOS spec, and that was something I wrote early on in the system, saying, okay, this is how certain things need to be done. We had some coding guidelines encoded as part of that. The big part of that spec was the anything that was going to be in that base, the things that replicated MS-DOS, they really needed to be written in C or assembly, as I mentioned before. Since then, we've actually codified that a little bit more, and we said, okay, our preferred assembler is NASM, the NetWide assembler, because that's an open source assembler, works everywhere, great assembler. And the preferred compiler is OpenWatcom. That's an open source compiler, works everywhere, works great, provides pretty tight code. Not every program in FreeDOS uses those two tools. Some people prefer a different assembler or a different C compiler, and that's fine. But if it's going to be in the base, we really are looking for those two tools to assemble. Now that said, there are always other C compilers, there are always different assemblers, and so, for example, TK Chia and some other developers have been working on an IA16 version of the GNU C compiler. So IA16 is the architecture. And so it used to be that if you wanted to run the GNU C compiler, GCC, there was a distribution called DJ GPP, which was the basically a distribution of a port of the GNU compiler to run on DOS systems, except that it needed to have that flat memory model that you find on Unix systems and Linux. And so basically it uses an extender. And so that's how all those programs are compiled. And that limits where you can run that program. As great as that program would be, you have to run it you can only run it on a system that supports running it on an assembler. So you have, or on an extender. So you have to run it on a 386 or higher machine. And that today in 2021 sounds like not a big deal, right? Because most people, when they install FreeDOS, they're installing it on a virtual machine. That's where we find most people are installing FreeDOS by numbers. And so, yeah, that seems like not a big deal, because a virtual machine is going to have that 386 or better support. Other people, if they're running on actual hardware, on bare hardware, well, the obvious hardware out there is going to be newer hardware, newer as in probably 2000 or later, because when you think about it, that's a machine released in 2000. That's 20 years old. So anything in the last 20 years, you can, up until this last year, you could actually run FreeDOS on it at bare metal. But there are a lot of people out there, at least a considerable number of people out there, that are real hobbyists on running the old hardware, and that means running an AT system, which is a 286, running an original IBM PC 5150 or an XT, right? These older systems that are not 386 or better. And so you do get some people. you do get
Oh,
some
sorry.
people out there that run that. And so IA16 is what that architecture is. And so TK Chia and some other people have actually made a version of the GNU C compiler that will run on the IA16. It requires a 3D6 or better to compile, but the output will run on any of those systems. And so, we actually do have a goal that FreeDOS is, and this is on our wiki, that FreeDOS is a 16-bit operating system, so it shouldn't require a higher level system. We're command line driven, single tasked, things like that. And so, that's kind of where our limitations are. Now, anybody who wants to contribute into that model absolutely can. And we're pretty free form about if it's not in the base, we're pretty open about what programming languages you use. And so you actually get in our extended utilities and some other things, you'll find some programs that are written in Pascal.
Have you ever faced a leadership challenge in FreeDOS over 23 years?
Leadership challenge is an interesting question. I a couple of times have stepped away, and continuity of leadership is very important. And at one point, early on, after I graduated, I then got a full-time job, and I kind of needed to focus on that. I felt a little overwhelmed doing FreeDOS and my full-time job, and so I stepped away for a while. And one of our FreeDOS developers, Hannibal Toll, stepped in and became the maintainer for a while. Another time, and then I came back because I had other stuff to do. I felt like I kind of missed doing FreeDOS, and at the time Morgan or Hannibal wanted to do some other things, and so he gave it back to me. And so at another time, I again kind of felt overwhelmed, and I needed to step away for a little bit. And so Pat Villani, who wrote our kernel, volunteered to come in and be the project coordinator for a while. And then when he became ill and couldn't run the project anymore, I came back to run the project. So, continuity has been very important. And so those times that I've stepped away, I always tried to make sure I was very open about what I was doing, shared documentation about, the things that I needed to do to kind of keep things running. In terms of a leadership challenge where people would come in and say, Jim's not doing a good job and I want to run this thing. We've had people that have tried to, I wouldn't say tried to, there's never really been an effort like that. I guess the closest you can come is there have been some people that kind of want to come in and take more credit maybe than they actually deserve based on the contributions that they made. But no, we've never really had a challenge in terms of leadership.
I just wanted to pause here and see if anyone else has a question they'd like to ask. Just give a moment in case people need to unmute.
Mm-hmm.
All right, if we don't have a question, I do have a kind of an ending question, which is, if a company is spinning out a project and they want it to land on its feet, as someone who both spun one out and sustained it, do you have a couple of key points to help them on their journey?
So a company that wants to, release a proprietary program as open source, is that what you're asking?
That's right. That's right. Spin up a new project. Yeah.
So, I actually just taught a course at Brandeis about open source. And if anybody wants to spin up their own project, whether it's a company, whether it's an individual, release something first. You have to have something there. You can't just say, I want to do X, and then expect that suddenly people are going to show up. That doesn't really happen in my experience. You have to have something first, something that provides, doesn't have to be, really a minimal viable product. It really has to be something that at least kind of shows the potential of how cool this is going to be. And so if you were writing an open source game, you don't actually have to have version 1.0 of the game out. You have to have enough of the game that people can kind of see, yeah, I kind of see where this is going. I kind of see what it can do. And they would help you to get to 1.0. Now, an important part of that is, so releasing the code and releasing something that, does something that's step one. From there, you really need to build the community, which is really what we're talking about here, right? So you need to find ways to welcome people. And so it doesn't matter what their abilities are, what their backgrounds are, what their interests are. If they're interested in your project, find a way to help them get on board. Don't set up obstacles, right? Projects that set up obstacles and say, you have to be this tall to ride, you have to know these things, or in some other way, making it a sort of an us them type thing. You're setting up obstacles. So you need to make it easy for people to join, and you need to provide suggestions for what people might work on, because sometimes somebody says, you know what, that's a cool project, I like using it. What are some things that they need? I'm not quite sure what I would do to contribute to that, but what are some things that they need? And that might be a place to start. And again, every open source software project needs help and documentation. So, if you're an open source software project and you are thinking about things to put on a list of things that people might do to help you out in your project, put documentation down. It's absolutely something that people want to do, or make it so that our project can be compiled more easily, right? A build model. I've contributed. We talked at the beginning. FreeDOS is just the longest thing I've worked on in open source software, but since that time, I've written or contributed to or maintained or otherwise been a contributor to open source software for several dozens of projects. The Gnome desktop is probably my next biggest thing. And so, how do I contribute to Gnome? I don't really feel comfortable enough as a developer to, touch the code and make changes and make improvements. I just don't feel like I have enough, familiarity with the tools. But I have an expertise in usability testing, because that's where that was the focus of my master's degree. And so when I was working on my master's degree, I reached out to Gnome and I said, I'd like to do usability testing with you. And to their credit, they didn't say, no, we're good. They said, absolutely. Let's here's some people that on the design team that would love that help. And were willing to work with me on doing some usability testing. So I did usability testing for them. And I've worked with them many times since. And in fact, worked with Gnome to mentor some interns. So, finding ways, that's a big recommendation I would make, is to find ways to make it easy for people to join. But I think also the last thing I mentioned there is, if you are doing open source, whether you are releasing it individually or whether you're an organization who's releasing a proprietary product as open source, you need to engage that community. If you just release it and maybe accept patches and bug fixes and things and then release those, that's like bare minimum, but you're not engaging anybody with that. And so you have to communicate. And so that means websites, Twitter, Facebook, email lists, discussion forums, whatever the channel is that helps you to talk to people who are developers of the product, but also users of it, right? It shouldn't just be the developers. You should be welcoming everybody in that. And so by having that engagement, you are going to make an open source software project, I think, a lot stronger.
Thanks, Jim. That was really fantastic. Everyone, you have one last chance to ask Jim a question. And if not, Jim, thank you for coming along and giving us a different insight. We're normally talking about pretty dry compliance and governance topics, and I think it's good to step outside, catch our breath, and look at the world in a different way occasionally. Thank you so much for your time. And everyone, please have a wonderful day.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for having me on.
It was so good to have you here.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you.
I'm just going to hit the end button on the meeting. You were just getting some clapping there. So people were sending their thanks in. Good day all.